Hello there, and welcome to the Mork Rock. Oh, wait, hold on. Where am I? The Base Edge Podcast.
Nice.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mork, your host, as well as my co-host, Joe Emilio from the Joe Emilio Podcast, and I'm Mork Rock from the Mork Rock Show. Yeah, Joe, hate speech. It's finally happening. We're finally having the conversation. It's been, almost a month and a half of waiting.
Yes. Our advocate that we wanted to speak to was inundated, with a lot of stuff. And I was also procrastinating. So I chatted to him briefly, and he said he's keen. So we've got a very knowledgeable and probably famous now advocate joining us tonight. But before we get into that, let's not forget, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, don't forget to also subscribe to the Apple Podcast, Spotify. And if you're listening to this, whether it be on your way to work, or maybe you're listening to this during work, or maybe you're listening to this before you go to bed, don't forget to also check out our YouTube channel where you can see us visually. We're also on Rumble, and we got pretty things happening on our screen, and you can see the face of the guest as well joining us, and you can see Mork's ugly face and laugh at it all the time to make you feel better. So yes, do follow us on all the social media platforms. Links are in the description. And also, Mork and I, like Mork said, we have our own YouTube channel, as well as our guest also has his own YouTube channel. We'll let him punt that towards the end of the show. If you want to check out all our YouTube channels, just go to the link in the description and check us out. And very quickly, one more thing. Our last episode exploded, which was about the white Mrs. Zimbabwean who won. So if you haven't checked that episode out yet, go check it out. Some base views were had, and I think the comment section was lit. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the topic tonight. We're going to be talking about, does hate speech exist? That's going to be the overall theme of tonight. And we brought in...
You needed help. That's why you brought him in. Couldn't have this debate alone with me.
Well, like we mentioned but that's a good point. In the Julius Malema episode that we did, we said we're going to do an episode on hate speech, and we're going to get a lawyer in who knows the law, because that's the best way to really get into the debate. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the one, the only Mr. Mark Oppenheimer joins us.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Hello.
I must say, it is a pleasure once again to have you join us. To chat to you, because I've chatted to you on my channel. And it's always a pleasure chatting to you, Mark. I'm very excited about the conversation we're going to have tonight.
So you guys want to know what hate speech is and whether it exists?
Well, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Let me give you my position. This is sort of, I've said it before. I'm a free speech absolutist. I reject the concept of hate speech as it is, as a legal punishable crime, because government has decided some words are offensive, and also due to the fundamental basis that sort of hate speech is subjective. That's sort of the premise. Again, and just to preface that, I think I don't think incitement to violence or call to action, that's not protected under free speech per se. But I think anything else should go. That's my sort of position.
My position is that it does exist. There is, words can hurt. I understand the concept of, one man's insult might not be another man's insult. I get that. And there's a fine line with it, but I do think that there is a societal influence that dictates, or at least influences, how people think and how people feel. So when certain words are said, like the N-word or the K-word, for example, for some people, it does create hurt. It does affect them in a certain way because of their past or what have you, or maybe the way they were brought up. We don't know. So I do think that in that regard, hate speech does exist. I'm still impartial, or not sure of how far the government should implement that, because I do believe that the law has its problems, but you are someone who knows the law very well, so maybe you can enlighten us.
Cool. It's nice to have a sense of where you guys see the debate. And I suppose the first position is to say Mork's clearly not a free speech absolutist. He accepts that there should be some limitations on speech. And, we want to ask ourselves, well, why? In other words, you think words can do something in the world. So the cases you've given are the incitement to harm cases. And you think, well, that's a reason to prohibit the speech or punish the speech. Now, I'll give you a sense of what the legal landscape looks like, and I'm going to talk about Joe's use of the term hurtful words. I was involved in a case called Kwalani. So I acted for the journalist John Kwalani, who'd written an article in 2008 where he'd said, I pray for the day when politicians will have the balls to change those parts of the Constitution that allow a man to marry a man and ditto women. And in the original trial, he was held liable for hate speech on the grounds that it was hurtful to the gay community. Some evidence was led about people who had been offended by the words and of problems of corrective rape in that community. I acted for him on appeal at the SCA and at the Constitutional Court, and the SCA held that the test that was used, which comes not from the Constitution but from something called the Equality Act, was unconstitutional. So what the Constitution says is that you've got these very large free speech rights. They include artistic creativity, academic inquiry, freedom of the press, and there are really only 3 instances where the speech is not protected. So in other words, where it's not part of your free speech right. So the one is propaganda for war, the second, the incitement of imminent violence, and the third, the hate speech clause, which is advocacy of hatred on one of 4 grounds: race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. So the Supreme Court of Appeal said, well, the test that's used in Papuda is much broader than that, being the Equality Act. So it used the term hurtful speech, and it also included many more grounds besides the 4 listed in the Constitution, including sexual orientation, but also things like language, nationality, birth, marital status, whether you were pregnant. And the court then declared the act unconstitutional. Went on further appeals to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court came up with a mid-position. So it said the act is unconstitutional, that hurtful speech is protected speech in terms of legally protected speech. And part of what we've sort of seen echoing through our case law in the constitutional era is really this idea that people are going to say things that are offensive and they are shocking, but they're nonetheless protected. So hurtful speech was scrapped. What you then had was to include in the test 2 things. The one is to retain that incitement to cause harm. So when you're calling on people to perform a harm against one of the targeted groups, and then whether the words themselves are harmful. Now, this is where things kind of get muddy. So one of the questions is, what's the difference between hurtful speech and harmful speech? Well, hurtful was meant to refer to kind of like emotional offense, a temporary feeling that you have, a feeling of anger or shame or sadness, but that kind of dissipates. Whereas harmful speech, you'd think, well, it causes some deep psychological trauma, the kind of thing that you need to substantiate with evidence. So you might want evidence from a psychologist showing that the speech has actually caused some kind of deep psychological harm that requires treatment like PTSD, a much higher level. So the Constitutional Court created that test. They ultimately held that Kwalani's article did amount to hate speech, and they included all the additional grounds as well. So not just the 4 listed in the Constitution, but sexual orientation, all the others. And the reason that they were able to do that is we have a thing in our Constitution called the limitations analysis, where you can limit rights provided that it's reasonable and justifiable to do so in an open and democratic society. So there's an acknowledgement that you're limiting free speech rights, but there was only so far they were willing to limit the rights. So that gives you a sense of where the landscape looks like legally. And the question is, well, now we've got these principles, we should know where we're going. Are they always applied? Do the courts get it right? Do they use those principles? Is there a concern that some groups get protection and others don't? You have statements from the Human Rights Commission basically saying that they would go easier on black offenders than white offenders, that it would matter who the targeted group is. Those things are alarming because one of the fundamental principles in our Constitution is the idea of equality before the law and of non-racialism. So the idea that we don't judge people based on the color of their skin, but rather on the content of their character. We don't have different rules for different races. So there is a hate speech case, which I was also involved in, for the Human Rights Commission versus Valapi Kamalo. So I acted for the Human Rights Commission there. Valapi had said we should do to white people what Hitler did to the Jews. They should be burnt alive, hacked to death, and their children turned into garden fertilizer. Now, Valapi was held liable for hate speech. And in the judgment, it's made very clear that we don't have different rules for different races, that all are equal before the law, and that it doesn't matter whether you're part of an ascendant group or a marginalized group. That's, we're going to treat everybody like an agent and hold them accountable. So that gives you a sense of what some of the legal landscape looks like. Now, there's a couple of other things that you might want to consider. So the one is, Joe talked about, if you're using racial epithets against people, it's hurtful nonetheless, right? Now, the question is, what do you want to do about it? Do you think there should be criminal sanctions? So that's one sort of extreme version. The other one is what the Equality Act has is not criminal sanctions, but civil sanctions. So you can be required to make an apology, pay a fine, pay damages to someone, or you can just have social opprobrium. So I imagine that if you go around referring to people in your workplace through racial epithets, that there will be consequences for that. People might not want to talk to you. You might get fired from your job. You might get boycotted online. That doesn't involve the state. And so you can think that there are other methods to deal with speech that you don't like.
I feel like that was a very, very long lawyer answer for basically saying it depends on each case.
But I think I agree with you. Like the concept of like because I mean, a lot of times when people say like, listen, there should be complete free speech, you're not what do you call it? You're not free from consequences. For example, like your example, where if I had to go around work using racial epithets to my coworkers, there's going to be consequences. The difference is it's not legal consequences, it's not the law stepping in for words that are sort of hurtful. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's like, I mean, I think also like maybe it's because of the stuff we do doing online stuff. We only see the one-sided. I mean, I was going through, I think it was the South African Human Rights Commission's page and just going like, there's, 5 cases against, mainly white people. And then there's, one case for Julius where they found, well, the people he referred to, and then they go into sort of that intersectional vibe of, well, it's people who are historically disadvantaged. And that goes to your point, because like if like with them deciding to take a case based on, well, this is people are previously, you're not basing, the law it's not equality under the law. That's like you've got special treatment for special people, which is weird. And it's like who are the people that's taking on these cases? I mean, if say, for example, if somebody I think on Sunday I had somebody telling me to, they want to massacre my family or my race. I'm going like, okay, I couldn't care about it. But I mean, who would take on that? If I wanted to prosecute them, I would have to hire a lawyer like yourself and then make a case against them. But the opposite happens. You've got the South African Human Rights Commission jumping on board, and they're going, okay, cool, we're going to take this case. We're going to, get it funded, and we're going to sue the person who said a mean thing to you, which is sort of that's the sort of weird part, how we see the landscape. I mean, is that sort of true? Is that happen a lot, or is that sort of just how we're viewing it?
Yes, so there is some analysis on where the hate speech cases go and where the complaints are received and which ones are prosecuted and which ones aren't. Solidarity did a study, I think in 2016, where they found that the Human Rights Commission tended to go after people who were white where the victims were black, and tended not to do that in the reverse. Although, of course, I've just given you the example of Valapi Kamalo, where I acted for the Human Rights Commission against Valapi, him being black and the victims being white. So you're right that you have a situation where, given that the commission has the power to go and institute in its own name or on behalf of others, and that it's a Chapter 9 institution, it's a it's a sort of public organ of state, that you want it to act in a manner that accords with the rule of law, that it's fairly doing so, and that it's not really picking sides in terms of who the targets are, who the perpetrators are, that it just says, let's go and look at the hate speech test and apply it fairly. And there's obviously a concern, and it opens itself up to criticism if it's not doing that. The alternatives aren't just doing it in your own name. You do find organizations who act on behalf of others. So AfriForum, for example, have been in the hate speech arena. And so there you have a civil society organization running cases on that line. And you can do it privately. The other kind of speech we haven't really talked a bit about is the breach of the Riotous Assemblies Act. So that's when you call on people to commit a crime. Julius was prosecuted for calling on people to invade land, trespass being a crime, and so calling people to commit that crime as itself a crime. He challenged the statute and was ultimately unsuccessful. So the Riotous Assemblies Act was held to be constitutional by the Constitutional Court. But that litigation hasn't gone anywhere. So the NPA didn't persist in their prosecution. So there's another sense in which, there's a worry that the prosecuting authority isn't acting, in an unbiased manner. There's also a concern that, Julius sits on the Judicial Services Commission and plays a role in the appointment of judges. That a particular judge had filed against him in a defamation suit. It involved, I think Trevor Manuel had sued Julius. That the judge then held him liable for R500,000. He then sought elevation. In other words, he's a High Court judge and he wanted to go to the Supreme Court of Appeal. And Julius said to him, "Why should I elevate you, given what you did to me?" So you have this naked bias. Parliament said to Julius, "You need to apologize for doing that. It's a very unparliamentary thing to do." So, of course, he took Parliament to court to interdict the apology and was successful.
That amounts to bringing the judiciary into disrepute.
Hypocrite!
So what's interesting, of course, about South Africa is that we have high levels of transparency. So these things are all videoed. You get a sense of, you can access court records, you can find out what happens. And you can sort of see the sausage being made, and some of the sausage is quite ugly.
I like that.
The sausage being made. That's brilliant. I mean, sorry, just kind of a quick off-topic question. I'm not really familiar with this, but like for some, I was told by, the understanding I have is and this is sort of as a lawyer question. For example, taking Zuma, right? So Zuma was in court, and then there was another case and another case. So if I understand it correctly, how does the legal system work? It's like if you appeal a specific court case or a specific thing, that new court case stacks on top of that, and then they just keep stacking. It almost feels like, as a viewer watching this happen, it feels like these court cases just seem to stack. And because of the process of how long it takes, it's like we're never, because like the initial case for Jacob Zuma was, corruption. That was the whole different thing. The 3-year inquiry. Yeah, that whole vibe, and then it led to this. But it's almost like, is that the process? Is we just stack cases, and then you got to deal with the newest one first to eventually get down? Can they not then use this tactic, if it is so, to just? By the time they actually get to his case, Zuma will be dead.
Okay, let me try and provide you a bit of clarity on that. So with Zuma, he's a complicated individual because you've got cases running in parallel. So there might be a series of different cases that are running through the courts. And the way they're reported is the Zuma litigation. But they're non-related to each other. So, for example, Zuma was held to be in contempt of court by the Constitutional Court. That's different from the arms deal cases. It's totally parallel. Yeah. Okay. But then you can have, as you say, the appeal court situation. So let's say you run a trial and you're unsuccessful. So now you appeal. So what you have to do is you ask that trial judge, will you allow me to go to another court? Because I think another court would find differently. So that judge can say yes or no. If they say no, then what you do is you petition the Supreme Court of Appeal and you say, look, this judge said no. I think I've got reasonable prospects of success. Will you entertain me? That court can say yes or no. If they say no, then you can petition the Constitutional Court. You'll notice that this is what happened with the EFF recently. There was a finding that they were interdicted from calling for people to invade land by AfriForum, in 2017. Because there was other litigation that I'd mentioned about them challenging the constitutionality of the Riotous Assemblies Act, the sort of interdict was practically paused. So they then sought leave to appeal because they'd lost in the High Court. All the other courts said no. They said, you've got no prospects of success, and the Constitutional Court has ultimately said that as well. And I think those matters are without hearings. So they basically, the other courts just said, well, there's no point in entertaining your appeal, you're dead. And the Constitutional Court just went all the way up. And that happened reasonably quickly because that original judgment was in 2017. So some cases are quick. I mean, often there's quick for lawyers and there's quick for normal people. Business people often go, this thing should happen tomorrow. And there are cases that I run where it happens not just tomorrow, but in a few hours. So I run cases, for example, where a body corporate's power is cut off by a municipality unfairly, and you've got hundreds of people who have no power, and they're sort of at risk of people invading their houses because the gates don't work, and so we go to court within a few hours and we get the electricity turned back on. The Kwalani litigation, he wrote his article in 2008. Ultimately, judgment came out in 2022. So you get a sense of the difference in how long things can take to get resolved.
All right. Just trying to get back to the whole topic at hand here. Hate speech, right? So you gave us I don't know, the lay of the land, if I can put it that way. For there's a lot of lawyer speak.
Order.
For what the law says hate speech is, and like you said, you were part of a case, quite an important one. What about the case you were a part of? I don't know if you can talk about it. You said that there was a bill that was aiming to be changed. I don't know if you remember, we spoke about it on my channel at the time. I think it was the hate speech bill or something like that. And it was going to be changed to be more ambiguous towards what exactly hurts you, like words hurt you. So what was the outcome? Did you win that? Did you?
Yes, it's an ongoing question. So the hate speech bill has been floating around since 2016. The first version of the bill, just so you know, I don't want to use too much jargon, a bill is basically a proposal for a law. If it's at the bill stage, it doesn't operate. So you can see bills floating around that have crazy language in them. There are things to be worried about if they were to become law. So it becomes law once it's an act and it's signed into operation. Hate speech bill that comes out in 2016. It comes out very opportunistically. It's sort of around the time of the Penny Sparrow debacle. Initially, it's greeted with massive applause from journalists who go, "This is wonderful. It's going to end racism." And then they realized, a whole bunch of us are going to wind up in prison for the ordinary things that we write. And so they rallied together to stop the bill.
That escalated quickly.
It then kind of died a quiet death for a while until resurfacing in 2018. And is now still debated. It's gone through many, many rounds of changes. It's had to take into account Kwalani as well, because that's the sort of case that has determined what our hate speech law looks like. But there is this concern, which is that the way the Equality Act works is that there are no criminal sanctions. So as I say, you can be made to apologize, you can pay a fine, but you can't go to jail because of the Equality Act. If you've also committed a crime in your speech, then the Equality Court can refer you to prosecution, but then it's a separate criminal matter. One of the things that matters as well is that in civil proceedings, it's a balanced probabilities. So kind of 51% are you liable. And in a criminal setting, it's beyond reasonable doubt, so kind of like 90%. There's also some stuff, you've talked a little bit about objective and subjective. So the way it works in the Equality Act is that we say, well, really, would a reasonable person think that the words demonstrate your intention to incite harm or be harmful? Okay, that's the sort of test. So it's an objective thing. We don't ask, what did you mean by the words? If you sort of say, well, I didn't mean it that way, that's not a defense. Okay. Typically in criminal cases, the idea is that your intent matters. So what you were thinking at the time matters. Now, often we've got to divine that from your words. And so there's a kind of very subtle distinction between these things. But ultimately, we tend to think that your direct intent matters.
If I, like, for example, said, like, to you, Mark, you're Jewish. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
Like,
easy now, Joe.
I do have to be careful because of YouTube.
Your Honor, I'll allow it.
But basically, if I said kill the Jews, like a fellow politician does in South Africa, different kind of race, is that where you guys question, like, you'd obviously take me to court because it's like that would probably fall under the hate speech thing, and you would then try and understand the intent of what I meant by that. Would it be like if I said, well, You already said that if I say, well, I didn't mean it like that, that doesn't count. But if I said like, well, it doesn't come from a place of hate, it comes from, it's just like something I felt at the time, but I didn't mean that I really want to take Jews to the gas chambers. Like, how would you really determine intent?
Yes. So, all right. So let's think about
Yeah.
that example, and we'll sort of play around with the words and the context. So let's say we say it's there's no factual dispute that Joe said kill the Jews. Okay. Now you can imagine you're standing on a stage in front of a bunch of neo-Nazis and you're zig heiling and you're saying kill the Jews. Okay. Pretty clear what the intent is.
I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Man, wokes are going to have a field day now, man.
That's going to be clipped.
About World War II, okay? And you say that, we should be really worried about anti-Semitism. Let me tell you what happened during the Holocaust. There were Nazis who said, kill the Jews, and that's condemnable, okay?
Yeah.
So there what you're doing is you're reporting on someone else's hate speech, and it's pretty clear, given the context, that your intent is not to call for the killing of Jews, it's to denounce it, okay? We can imagine that there's some work of fiction that you're writing where the term is used as well, and it's clear that that's not your intent as an author. It's words you put in a character's mouth. All that stuff's going to make a difference. Generally, when we think about, let's say someone is driving a car and they run over someone and that person dies, we want to know what is their mental states. Okay, so were they drunk? In which case they couldn't have had an intent, but they were clearly negligent by driving drunk. The other one is that they were deliberately trying to kill that person. So it's a revenge killing. They say, I saw you sleeping with my wife, and I, saw you on the road, and I intend to kill you. Okay. So the facts, what we see in the world looks identical, but we go and peer into the mental states to determine, well, is this a crime? What kind of crime is it? Is it culpable homicide? Is it murder?
But now what if I claim, okay, when I said it, but I was drunk. Now, how isn't that like a loophole now? Like, I feel like how do I have to prove that I was drunk?
Yes. So there's different kinds of presumptions in our law, and different kinds of onuses. So in a criminal setting, what you've got to do is say that the person had the intention, had the requisite mental state, that they caused the harm, and that they did it in a manner that was a breach of the law, was wrongful. And so you might say, well, it seems apparent to us that you said the words, and it caused the harm, and now the onus has shifted to you, and you can say, well, look, I did say the words, but I had just taken 3 tabs of acid, and I had no idea what planet I was on, and the stuff came out of my mouth, sure, but it wasn't causally connected to me. I had no mental states that were putting that there, and so that would be a good criminal defense. Yeah, there's some cases, you get these cases with epileptics and driving. So the one case is they're driving and they lose control of their body due to an epileptic fit, and they kill someone. Okay, and they're acquitted on the grounds that they couldn't have intended to, of course, they didn't have control of their bodies. Second case where an epileptic does it, okay, and is convicted. They say, well, how can you have this difference? They said, well, the second epileptic knew that they had these fits, and they knew that they could take a medication that would stop them, and they didn't.
Okay.
So they reconciled themselves to the idea that my driving could lead to someone's death. So you kind of get that dolus eventualis, reminds you of the Oscar case style intention. So, there was
it's very complicated, actually, to get to. I mean, even if you're accused of doing hate speech, it can get quite complicated to be prosecuted, as we've seen with previous cases and some of the examples we've used now. But I think also what's important to get into here is, does it exist? Now, you, Mark, as a lawyer, advocate, I know you fight the good fight, man. I loved you in the Julius trial. I really did. But I gotta know. I gotta know. Do you think it exists? Do you, like, from a personal, take yourself, I don't know if you're allowed to say it, but like, take yourself out of the advocate world on just a philosophical.
But what do you mean when you ask him, like, does hate speech exist, or do you believe that it should exist? Like we should have laws based on words that are harmful or words that can make people feel emotionally pain, be offended by. Is that what you mean?
Question. Yeah, use that question.
Yeah. So I do have a personal view on it. I think we should protect speech as far as possible, so that you should protect offensive speech. One of the reasons why you should protect offensive speech is that often people can be mistaken about what is true. They can hold a view that is viewed as offensive. So, for example, for most of human history, people thought the idea of gay marriage was either incomprehensible or disgusting, or the kind of thing that should be illegal, right? And there were some people who dared to express the offensive view that two men ought to be allowed to marry each other. And eventually they managed to persuade a lot of people of the truth of that view. And you have had global change allowing for gay marriage. You've had similar kinds of revolutions in thinking regarding the abolition of slavery, removing segregation, or interracial marriage. So these were all things that were seen as offensive at some point in time. And so it's very important to allow someone to say the offensive thing. So it's unclear whether some things are objectively offensive. In other words, is everybody offended by it? Is that sufficient? There's some unwritten law in the universe that determines the thing is offensive, or is it just a subjective feeling that sort of shifts over time? I think offense, as I say, should be protected, and you might have reasons not to be offensive in certain settings. So, in other words, we don't want the law to step in and prohibit it, but we think that when you're having dinner with grandma over Thanksgiving turkey, that you might not want to, say to her, "This is the worst turkey I've ever had in my life," and you have some politeness reason not to say that kind of stuff, right? But we don't want to punish you for it. Then the question is, what kinds of speech should we prohibit? I think it's pretty obvious to me that if you are instructing someone to perform an assassination, that we want to prohibit that kind of speech. It's just words. And there are some true free speech absolutists who just go, we just punish the guy who pulled the trigger. The fact that you told him to do it, that you, invite him to do it, or that you stood in front of a mob chanting and saying, kill this guy, burn him alive, and they did it. Well, we punished them. It's not your fault. My view is you can punish both.
But hold on, I wanna actually talk about that, because that is an excellent point. We've seen this even with the Julius Malema thing, when it comes to kill the Boer on social media. So many people are saying, like, and not just EFFers, it's like people who believe, like, to the death that we should just have absolute free speech, no matter how bad it is, because again, like you just said, it's just because somebody that I don't know happened to hear me and then pull the trigger. That's not really my fault. It's just words. So on a philosophical level, Mark, at what point is it just words? You know what I mean? Like, I do see the point there as well. Like, in a way, the libertarian in me is like, yeah, it would be nice to just say whatever the fuck I want to say. You know what I mean? Like, that'd be great. And no consequences. Why? I can get that. Like, I can't say it on YouTube, but but just go out and do whatever you want to do, right? You listening right now, just, you see that person, give them a huge ass kiss. I can't be held liable if they do that or not. But I don't know. What's your philosophical view on that? Like, why should there be a limitation there?
Yeah, so if you look at what the Constitution says, the idea is that there's a difference between the incitement of imminent violence. Okay, so there's a difference between standing in front of the angry mob who've got their pitchforks ready to kind of like burn the Mozambican guy alive, something that's really happened in South Africa, because it's imminent and there's a very good chance that the harm will result, versus slowly saying things that may cause harm to result in the future. And the idea is, you might say, well, there's room for people to kind of inject their own thoughts to counter the hatred with more words. But we basically say we don't need that imminent test when it comes down to hatred against particular groups. And I think part of that is given our own history, given that there's there's certain groups who do seem more vulnerable, that there are a history of people being killed because of their race or because of their sex, because of their nationality, and that it might be harder to deal with that merely with counter dialogue. But again, I think it makes a difference what your sanction is. So in other words, are you jailing the person? And this is, we got a little bit sidetracked, but the hate speech bill will now criminalize hate speech. And so you're suddenly in a different arena where you can get 8 years in jail versus merely having to apologize. And there, one of the difficulties that we have is that Kwalani says, well, we'll tolerate this idea of punishing speech or prohibiting speech that's harmful as opposed to incitement to harm. Now, you might think that's okay in the civil arena, but not okay in the criminal arena. In other words, when we're trying to work out, well, is this speech harmful or not, you really want to be able to ramp up what that means, or say, no, we've got to stick by the strict constitutional standard of it's only these incitement to harm cases. For example, the old South African flag has been determined by the Supreme Court of Appeal to be hate speech. Now, you're dealing with a symbol. Okay. Now, a lot of people would say it's merely offensive. They'll say it causes emotional distress. People don't like it. But it's not like you've got evidence of someone saying, look, I had PTSD, I had to go to a psychologist when I saw it. There's this sense in which you could have a double standard that emerges. And the idea of people being thrown in jail for showing offensive symbols should remind us of what happened during apartheid, when people who had ANC flags on their cups got jailed. And it seems like you don't want to go back to those dark days.
Well, is the Nazi flag banned?
In South Africa, it's not. So
in Germany, do you know?
Yes.
Yes. So in Germany, yes, and in Austria, yes. But there are still, so it's done through legislation. It details all the instances in which you can use it and which you can't use it. One of the exceptions was in the use of art.
Captain Klenzendorf. Heil Hitler.
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 And there was a long debate about whether video games constitute art. So, for example, the game Wolfenstein, the game that's normally made available to people has the Nazis with swastikas, and you go and hunt Hitler.
Have you taken your German lessons?
There you come, Commandant.
The German version of that game, they changed the symbol and they removed Hitler's moustache. And they recently changed the view on that. And so they recognize video games as art, and so their Wolfenstein now has swastikas in it. So the context seems to matter. I take the view as a Jewish South African whose grandparents escaped Nazi Germany, that I think it is a good thing that we don't ban the swastika. So I'll explain what I mean. I think you're doing an incredibly despicable thing if you wave a swastika around in a way to inflame hatred. Okay.
Totally.
But in South Africa, we almost never see anyone do it. It's really the kind of thing that's happened only a few times over the last 2 decades that you see a swastika scrawled anywhere. Now, the advantage of that is that
Mork did it last weekend, so I'll send you the invite next time.
You sit on a throne of lies.
We get a sense of what the appetite is for anti-Semitism in South Africa because it's not illegal. So you can monitor those people. They're giving you free information. They're telling you we're hate mongers who don't like Jews, and you know how many of them there are. If they do it as well, you've got other opportunities to change their mind. So, for example, the former head of the Wits SRC had made a series of anti-Semitic statements where he said he's a friend of Hitler. And what the Jewish Board of Deputies did was they said, look, we think you've said this out of some sense of ignorance, so we invite you to come to the Holocaust and Genocide Center. He went and he said, I didn't really know what I was saying. I'm incredibly sorry for what I said. And that can play a role in getting other people to change their minds. One of the people who you both might be aware of who's done an incredible job on this front is Megan Phelps Roper. So she was a member of the Westboro Baptist Church. The church is best known for holding up signs saying God hates fags and celebrating the deaths of American soldiers. They would also picket at funerals. So they went to the funerals of children who were killed during the Sandy Hook massacre. They would go to funerals of American soldiers who'd been killed during Iraq, and they would hold up these signs. And she grew up in the church, and part of her job was to really spread their message online. So she would be on Twitter, spreading all sorts of vile, bigoted views. And people started debating her. And they changed her mind ultimately by pointing out some of the contradictions within her own belief system. And ultimately, she left the church and now spends an enormous amount of time trying to deprogram people who are filled with hate. And doing it as someone who says, I was once an insider in one of these movements, and I understand how it works, and I understand how you could believe this stuff. Let me explain to you why it's wrong. That's enormously powerful, and that's because you've got free speech. There's a famous case where the church was picketing one of these funerals, and they were taken to court and sued for it and held liable for $10 million. And ultimately, the American Supreme Court said, you got to allow this kind of speech. People are going to say things that are really offensive. But if you prohibit it and have these, make them liable, it's going to clamp down on the arena. And so as much as you can think the speech is despicable, you might think it ought not to be legally prohibited.
Yeah, I agree with. I totally agree with that. But so I had a question for you. So I mean, like we were talking about the whole flag. I mean, so the reason the Nazi flag is illegal in Germany was because of the Holocaust and because of what Hitler did, right? Then how come the communist flag isn't? Because that's almost 100 times more deaths, 100 to 160 million people. Somehow we've got organizations like that's this weird thing about it, that it's like, this thing is bad. The old South African flag is back. Yet here's this thing that is it's ultimately worse than all of them combined, but it's totally fine because of the ideology of the government.
Here's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people don't know this, but the Germans don't just prohibit the swastika. They prohibit communist symbols as well. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so East Germany was occupied by the Soviets, and the way that they phrase the legislation is that they talk about the symbols of the oppressive regimes. So there's a case of a guy, it's cited as Vajnai, a guy who had a communist star and was prosecuted for wearing the star. So in South Africa, as you say, like people, very happy to wave communist symbols around. We have the South African Communist Party. As you say, it's, communism has, caused 100 million deaths around the world, sort of tens of millions by the Soviet Union and 60 million in China. It's a really evil system. But yeah, those symbols are banned in Germany. So yeah, it's just one of those things that's maybe not reported as much. And when you had people in South Africa sort of saying, well, swastika is banned in Germany, so therefore you should ban the South African flag, you'd say, well, are you comfortable banning the hammer and sickle here as well?
Objection!
And they would say, no, it's a wonderful symbol of liberation in South Africa.
Means of production.
Well, I think Mork just got fact-checked.
No, but so I've got actually another question. So you mentioned earlier on there, like the case that you dealt with, like when the issue about the guy calling, making the remarks about gay marriage, right? So he got found guilty for hate speech, correct?
Yes.
But you said the measurement was that they actually they would go and get a psychologist to measure, for example, the emotional pain that someone would experience. Now, my question would be, say, for example, in the case of Penny Sparrow, right? She said, she related people on the beach to animals. Like, how do you do that? Because I'm sure, again, correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't go randomly pick, 1,000 people, have them go to a psychologist and go like, do you feel emotional pain when someone makes a reference to this, right?
Yeah, so what's interesting is I think the view now is that Penny Sparrow's case was wrongly decided. So she's held liable on the grounds of hurtful speech, quite explicitly. It relies on a prior case called Hasselman, where someone referred to someone else as I think as an ape or a gorilla or a monkey. There was a debate for a long time about how to interpret the legislation. It basically said hate speech is hurtful speech, harmful speech, incites harm. There's no and or an or in it. And so there was a view, well, we can interpret it to read or, and so merely hurtful speech would be sufficient to have hate speech. And that's how Sparrow was held liable. What the Kamalo case did was explicitly overturn that and said that you must read in ands, and the Constitutional Court chucks out hurtful speech. So as much as the case that I think when everyone thinks of hate speech, I think of Penny Sparrow, an honest court trying that case now could not find hate speech.
Wow, that's interesting.
I mean, because when it happened, I looked at it going like, it's wow, the leap to make that leap going, well, the intent is how do you how do you read someone's mind? Because they're going like the analogy of going like, hey, these, like, if you see kids playing on a jungle gym, kids are acting like monkeys or something like that, right? Or you have to see a bunch of kids being messy. Because I go to my friend's house, they have kids like, these, they call their children baboons because there's just like litter everywhere. They're just messing. So like how would a court be able to infer or like read the mind, establish that the intent of her was to be racist? You know, what did they go and look at previous statement that she's made and go like, maybe she's racist? But again, you did say that it was kind of wrongly.
Yeah, it's wrongly decided. But you're right, there's this problem of saying, well, when we're trying to divine your intent, we're not supposed to ask you what you intended on the hate speech test. We look at the words on their own. So we don't go and look at other things that you've said necessarily. We look at the words on their own. We look at the context in which you said them. So that gives us some sense of what the words could mean. It's not clear to me that this stuff is applied well. So, for example, what the Constitutional Court does in Kwalani is it imports this international law standard where it says, okay, you've got to look at the identity of the speaker. So are they a powerful person? Is this a politician? Is this a nobody? You know, is there a likelihood that harm will result from the words? What are the conditions in which they said this? Was it, done in a mass way, or was it a private communication? Those are all things that are supposed to be taken into account, and they, not really taken into account as well as one would expect in some of the litigation.
But if let's say like I was chatting, or I was like Mark was over at my house, okay, and then I said, yo, this little girl of mine is like a monkey, man, and he just happened to be recording it, whether audio or video, and then he tries to take me, like, he betrays me, he hates me, the podcast didn't do as well, he's hated me ever since, and now he tries to take me to the Human Rights Commission or whatever case and takes me to court or whatever. What you're saying is they would look at the whole context, like where I was, who I said it to, blah, blah. And obviously the court would rule that I didn't have intent to be racist. I was talking, and it was a term of endearment in a way, or it was like a pet name or whatever you want to call it, or not even a pet name, like just a joke, like, they would see it that way, right?
Well, okay, so there's what the law requires and there's what will happen in practice. So obviously there's a concern that our courts aren't applying the law properly, that context is being shoveled out, that looking at what the words actually mean isn't what's happening, that there's political pressure. So those are all concerns. A good example, in German and French, the word cabbage has different meanings. The one, it refers to someone as like my little baby cabbage, it's like a term of endearment, and the other one, it's this person's an idiot. Okay, so the same referent has very different meanings depending on the language which you use, right? So that's got to play a role in determining what someone means. I do think you can use coded language. I think you can say things that are like really abusive, or a kind of dog whistle to have people killed. So, for example, in Rwanda, referring to people as cockroaches had a certain kind of connotation to it. It's not clear that connotation always travels. So, here in South Africa, for example, Kenny Kuneni referred to Julius Malema as a cockroach. And he said, what I meant was when I was a kid, he says he's a frog and a cockroach. I would have cockroaches eating my food and I would brush them away and they were an irritant. It's not clear there's any Rwanda reference in the speech, that's sort of top of mind for him. And Kuneni was held liable for hate speech. Its matter is currently on appeal. So, yeah, there is a sense in which our law has been clarified for the last year or so, but its implementation is all over the show. And I think onlookers look at it and go, I have no idea how courts get to these outcomes.
Yeah. So I mean, I've got another example of by the way that you're explaining it, it kind of sounds like it's hit and miss, but it seems a bit better formulated as to what the overall legal perspective is. It doesn't seem as bad as, and I give you an example of a court case was I don't know if you're familiar with the Count Dankula case where the pug dog, I mean, for example, if that had to happen in South Africa, because of the context of comedy, he wouldn't have been prosecuted. So technically you're saying that the British or the Scottish legal system is like, it's a bit more hectic on hate speech than it is in South Africa.
Yeah, so we do find that the Americans are probably the most permissive legally of speech, although culturally, I think it's become very hard to say things that are slightly offensive, and your career can be ruined. If you make a claim there are only two sexes, for example, that could be the last thing you ever say while gainfully employed. Whereas in South Africa,
Well, there are only two sexes, so let's see what happens.
Yeah. You can say what you're saying. I don't think anyone cares or thinks anything of it. But
Wait for it. Wait for it, Mark. Wait for it.
in terms of legal protection,
Soon.
I say the Americans give very strong legal protections, and the Europeans less so. So they're more restrictive of speech. You find cases of people being investigated in the UK for things they've said on Facebook, and you've also got a state with resources. So I think in 1 year there were like 800 people, who got door knocks from the cops saying, "Hey, you said this thing on Facebook. We're investigating you." Whereas in South Africa, when it happens, it's pretty rare. I mean, I remember if you look at a case, a legal case, you'll see it as a case number, and normally it's case number 51,732 of the year. I was involved in 3 equality court cases, which were reported as 1, 2, and 3. So it's very rare.
Oh, wow.
It's not something that happens very often. They just when you hear about them, they tend to get televised and publicized, and there's a lot of discussion about them. Yeah, it is sort of a rare thing that happens. We may find that if the hate speech bill becomes a law, that you'll then have this weapon that's used to intimidate people, to arrest people. I mean, you already have a situation where the journalist Karen Morn was prosecuted by Zuma in a private prosecution, basically in an effort to silence her. Zuma has lost that case, but is sort of seeking further appeals, and it's basically a way of trying to terrorize the press. And so you might very well have that concern if the hate speech bill ever becomes an act. And there are some serious concerns with that law. But it is interesting that civil society has played quite a firm role in trying to stop it being passed, or trying to improve it so that it's not as pernicious as earlier drafts have been.
So where is it now? Is it like almost accepted? Is it like towards the end of its editing? Where is it now?
It's passed through the National Assembly, and it's gone through to the National Council of Provinces. So we have, like in the States, you have the House and the Senate. We have a similar system to that. But of course, because we have single party dominance, you don't really have much pushback. I think what's happening is some people in the provinces are looking at it and going, hold on a sec, there's implications for my speech. I think it's interesting that the EFF haven't pushed back against it, because I would imagine that they could find themselves imprisoned if it would be passed. They might take the view that they think the system is so rigged that we'll always get away with it. But that's a gamble. You never know who's going to be in power in 10 years' time. And having that kind of legislation floating around could be a weapon that's used against them.
Could if someone, like, let's say, for example, the DA wins the elections or whatever, okay, can a new government or a new person who's governing the country, can they, for lack of a better term, delete acts?
Yeah, of course. And one would hope that if you did have a Moonpack coalition, that the first thing that they would do is pick out all the bits of terrible legislation that have been floating around and repeal them. You repeal it in a similar way that you do enacting it, so you take a vote. This is what happened at the end of apartheid. A whole bunch of really pernicious laws were repealed because of a change in government.
Okay, cool. So in other words, go vote.
I just wanted to actually tell you, because I was watching a Change My Mind video, Stephen Crowder video today about hate speech, and literally in the video he refers to, I think it was in 2019 he made the video where there was something like 3,500 cases in the UK where people were prosecuted for hate speech things, saying something on Facebook, saying something on Twitter, and we've seen videos of people rocking up at someone's door and stuff. But I have one other question I wanted to ask you, which is, it's kind of a philosophical question about the concept of the law in South Africa. So how can South African law be considered just and legitimate when it allows the state to legally discriminate against most of its citizens based on the concept of race within BEE? I mean, it's almost like it feels like it's contradictory. There's a legal system that allows this to happen, and yet this other part of it is like, is the court contesting, is the constitutional court is fine with that, when that's sort of a contradiction of our sort of constitutional right as to be equal under the law, to not be judged by your race, but yet that exists, and the law finds it's fine, and then it feels like this contradictory sort of position that our legal system has by, having these two things.
Yeah, there's undoubtedly a tension in that. As I say, Section 1 enshrines this value of non-racialism. Section 9 deals with equality before the law, but also talks about having measures that could redress the wrongs of the past.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that there's this balancing act that's happened to try and take that stuff into account. Now, I take the view that particular individuals who suffered an injustice due to apartheid should have some corrective measures to advance them. I just don't think you can do that on the grounds of racial clustering. So first of all, because you've had a massive passage of time, you've got 30 years, I think there's a huge difference between someone who was discriminated against during the course of apartheid, who wasn't able to marry the person they wanted to, live in the area they wanted to, get a job of their choosing, versus someone who was born in 2000 and is now 23 and was born sort of, in a constitutional democracy. They're just in different places. So I don't think that we should treat people as tokens for a type, as interchangeable with each other. And so one hopes that our law develops in that manner. There's been some debate around the recent BE legislation and the regulations, which has pretty hard race-based quotas that strike me as unconstitutional, that necessarily would cap the number of people who are allowed to work in the private sector based on their race. It's the sort of thing that makes Verwoerd smile, I imagine. We think that.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly correct. Yeah, it feels like it's just the pendulum's kind of gone from the one end where this completely racist sort of National Party apartheid South Africa. It's just sort of, and it just gets worse and worse and worse to the other side. It's like the ANC are now just. It's just weird. It's like, does that just happen throughout history where the pendulum just slicks one way to the other way? It's just the extremes each and every time.
I suppose what you might find is that when you're the underdog, you use moral language and you say these laws are unjust and any moral person would never countenance laws like this. When you're in power, you might use moral language another way, which is we've been hard done by, and so we need special rules, to kind of keep us going. And you had Afrikaners doing this as well, right? So they would say we were treated badly by the British, and so we need to have special protections for our people. And the worry is when you're running a grievance politics game, you wind up in a society that's continually causing new and new grievances, that you want to move to a state of genuine equality. There's also just vicious power play going on with the ANC, right?
Yeah.
It's not a matter of like, we need to justify this. It's just like, what are you going to do about it?
How do you stay in power?
Yeah.
All right. So I have a question because I think this is really going to be interesting. So, use previous example. We know of examples of people in South Africa who have used the K word. They've either gotten severely punished, both by society and by the law. Now, usually, or not usually, in these cases that we know that have gone viral, it's a white person saying it to a black person. But what if it's a black person saying it to a black person? Does that still amount to hate speech?
Well, we must distinguish between hate speech and other kinds of prohibited speech. For example, if you look at Vicky Momberg's case, you had a criminal injuria situation where she sort of used it in an abusive manner, was held liable for that. The K word has been viewed as a criminal injuria since the 80s. There is a case of a black person calling another black person by that term, and they were held liable.
What?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't believe that. It doesn't happen. I thought black people couldn't be racist.
But all right, that's good to know. That's good to know.
I have a question on the criminal injuria thing, because I found the language, and this is that one specific word, dignity. Dignity. I always think of Stan's dad in South Park where he says integrity, but it's the whole vibe of dignity. It's just this very broad term that can mean anything. It's like, if your dignity, if you disrespected or something like that, therefore I can sue you. It feels weird and just sounds strange that there's this law as if I offend your dignity, therefore you're liable for criminal injury.
So first of all, I think it's useful to think about it. In other words, let's say you have the black person calling another black person by the term, Okay, you might think it might not demonstrate that they hold an animus to a whole racial group, but it does show that they have an intention to demean this person. Okay, and so that's why they're held liable under criminal injury as opposed to hate speech. We do recognize dignity and reputation in our law, and I think a lot of places do with regards to defamation. So, for example, if I say Joe is a child molester, or he's the world's worst comedian, we can say, well, these things have affected his reputation. And then there's a question of, okay, well, am I allowed to say both or only the one? It makes a difference whether it's false or not, and whether it's the expression of an opinion. So, for example, when you're evaluating someone, like, I don't like this person's art, we want to say that it's important that you're entitled to express opinions, even if it does affect the person's reputation. They can counter dialogue it. But when you say something false, like Joe's a child molester, we want to say that's affected his reputation in quite a severe way, and he should be able to sue because of it.
Okay.
On dignity, there's different ways of understanding it. Our courts grappled with the idea. So the one is, it's about well-being. So, in other words, your emotional state, your reputation, what makes you, do well in the world. And the other one is that it's about your autonomy. So your ability to lead a life of your choosing. And those things are different. Sometimes you sort of see the word dignity, scattered on things like tomato sauce, and it's not really doing any real work. And so I understand why you have a concern about it. I happen to run a philosophy show called Brain in a Vat. And we've done many conversations about trying to come to grips with these things. And we had an expert on dignity come along on the show. We've done lots of episodes on free speech and hate speech and open inquiry. So most of our guests are American academic philosophers. We recently made the New York Times because one of our guests appearing on the show was told that he wouldn't be allowed on his campus. And he hasn't been allowed on his campus for a year and a half for his own safety, because the Americans know you can't interfere with someone's job because of what they say, because you're entitled to express your ideas in an academic setting. But they thought that it would be dangerous for him to be on campus. And so that story is at the New York Times, and he's currently litigating to be allowed back on.
See what South Africans do. See what South Africans do. You see, this is the problem. This is the problem. Oh man, sorry, Mark. Mork.
No, sorry. That wasn't one of the Weinstein. Brett Weinstein. That was not Brett Weinstein.
No. Our guest is Stephen Kirshner. So if you do a search for the Kirshner controversy, the episode with him is on sexual taboos, and it is controversial material. And so we talk in some detail about what kinds of sex acts are immoral or disgusting or should be illegal. And he ruffled some feathers in that. But the idea with the show is that we think it's important to be able to have open conversations with people that we disagree 100%. With. My co-host and I, Jason Weberlove, always say that we agree on almost nothing, except for this idea that it's important to have conversations. And so even if we disagree with each other, we're able to do that very politely. And with our guests, we try and adopt positions that counter their views, even if we privately agree with the guest, because we think one way to find out what's true is to clash swords.
Yes.
Yeah. And I still haven't been invited on that show. And Mark's been on my show. It's like,
so when you get a PhD in philosophy, you're very welcome.
Yeah, go for it, dude. Go for it. I mean, I personally love philosophy. I think I got into, this is back before, I don't know if you know Stefan Molyneux. I started 2014. I think I started watching him, and got introduced to a lot of people. And this is something quite. I remember seeing Aaron Ritz on there give an explanation about the concept we were talking about earlier, where you go like you've got this sort of repeating of history, where it was like the Afrikaners, because if you look at the context of what happened in 1880 or something like that, the Slag van Butterfield, when they killed people. Those same people were like 40 years old, when the new government. So they had this hate of people because of a race, because of what happened to them. And now you've just got the repeat of that going the other way. And like in 30, 40 years time from now, we're going to have the marginalized white people get back into power, and it's just going to happen all over again. I hope not. But, he put that into context, and it was like, wow, it's just like, just looking at history and understanding the context of how close these things happen to each other. It changed your mind about how why these people maybe did what they did, why they had this hatred towards people of a race. Make me understand, why would someone just pass these laws? Or again, it was the British who implemented segregation, but the Afrikaner sort of government kept it there, and from their point of view, it was a good reason to keep it there.
Yeah, Ern's put in the hard yards and got a PhD, so he'll be.
All right. Very okay. So we're going over time, and so sorry, Mark. I know you're a very busy guy.
You know, lies built by the 6-minute increments. So now you're in the
Just
second hour.
send me an invoice. I won't pay it, but send it. Add it to my tab. So where do we stand, boys? Like, let's just get to the thing here. Like, does hate speech exist in terms of? I guess I'm kind of answering my own question, because like we have laws, we have a hate speech bill that's about to come into play here. But I feel that it does. I feel that people should be able to defend their dignity, should be able to defend if they really feel, and you can prove it in court, that this person really went through a traumatic experience. They maybe, I don't know, really got some hectic emotional damage from it. Maybe they got depressed. I don't know. Or maybe it just like it really invokes some kind of emotion within them when they hear certain terms, or when someone said something. And some people are tough. Some people you can say a lot of horrible things to. I mean, I say a lot of horrible things to Mork on the show, and he takes it like a champ. So, I mean, there's that too. So, but the point I'm getting at is, I do think that in some cases, in each situation, which I think has been made clear by Mark Oppenheimer tonight, is that each situation is different. Each situation needs to be taken under a microscope and completely understood from almost all angles, if possible. And in that light, provided that we have a government and a law system that can implement it well, I would say that hate speech does exist. That's my thing.
I would jump in. I think it's a very slippery slope. I mean, I think the context of what's happening, if you can see, like Mark, like you pointed out, in America, it's almost like it happens privately in the private sector. Society does it, which is far worse than what happens here. I mean, people lose their jobs. You get it's a complete shit show. But I like their legal system of the law's not going to come after you. I would prefer if our legal system went more that way. I would, it's like the whole vibe of like, if you swing your arms and you hit somebody, then that's where the law should step in. The same with hate, with like incitement to violence, imminent violence. If I'm calling a mob and go, listen, go kill this person, or like, here's $500, Mark, will you shoot Joe? And it happens, like that. But I think other than that, it's like it should end there. That should be the line, because like you said, from the beginning of time, beginning of history, like minority movements, the gay rights, suffragettes, everything came from people being able to say stuff they weren't allowed to. Malcolm X, all of that, like slavery, segregation, everything came from that part where a small minority or a population was allowed to say things. And I think limiting that would have disaster effects. And if you look at like using the pug dog Count Dankula example, I mean that's just a complete gross violation where like the court goes, context doesn't matter, and that's just the beginning of it. It's like it's just getting worse. So I would prefer to remove it. I think, yeah, that's my position on it.
Sorry, I want to add to what you're saying there, or I want to add to what I said earlier. Like, I'm not saying that there should be a limit to, because you referenced like Malcolm X and stuff like that. That should be allowed. But if you get to the point of Hitler where you're saying, or you're like, telling a population like Jews are the problem, for example, or a specific race is the problem, that's where I draw the line. And I'm like, well, I think some kind of authority needs to step in and make sure that that doesn't happen again. However, if it's someone who's on a soapbox on a corner of a street saying like, yeah, no, the government's the problem and we got to band together, blah, 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 but they're not inciting violence, they're just giving an opinion about whatever, that's fine. Like, that should be allowed. That's kind of where I'm at.
Just a quick question. So, for example, because what Hitler did was similar to what we had a previous discussion where we went like, it didn't just begin with, listen, let's gas the Jews. It started with, they're the problem, look at them, they own the stuff. Now, the same thing is, are you saying, there's a question, Joe, are you saying that we should try and stop stuff like that, because that's already happening in the context of, if you look at the entire world, Western civilization towards ending whiteness, stop being white, you've got that across education, across media, across everywhere. I mean, that was maybe 5 years away from, that's what Hitler was doing. It's the exact same thing. So are you saying we should curb that? That should be considered hate speech, or is that still free speech?
So it's difficult because like context matters, right? So like,
Yeah.
and that's a very good question, Mark.
Because you wouldn't be able to say any of those things about black people, right? You couldn't say like, we need to end black thinking, we need to end blackness. I mean, like, you would get like roasted over the coals. Like, it's the end of you. But somehow that is societally accepted. They teach it at college, and it's insanity. But
But
so,
okay,
like,
but do you think that should be banned then?
no.
Okay.
So you might, so just to give you some clarity on this, you might think that it's a bad thing when you start denigrating people on the grounds of their race and their sex. But if there's no call to action, you've just got the propagation of hatred, you might think, well, the best way to deal with that kind of speech is with more speech, with counter dialogue, that you try and change people's minds. That allowing people to say hateful things exposes them, and it gives you a sense of what other measures you need to address it. Once it tips over, so you're not just vilifying the group, but you're calling for something to happen to them, that's why you might want some additional regulation. Now, on the social level, you say in the States, you've got a society that provides very strong legal protection for speech, but you've had this social mania where people are cancelled, and you've got a, as you say, a move to sort of run a race-based agenda in education. And the question is, how do you deal with that? And you might think it's just going to be this messy environment that eventually sort of self-regulates through enough people changing their minds and working out what speech they'll tolerate. You find that wokeness isn't always in constant ascendancy. It goes through periods where people think it's the most wonderful thing, and then it sort of falls out of favor. I think people have claimed peak wokeness quite a few times over the last decade. It is one of those things that manages to rear its ugly head quite often, but countering it with more speech and better ideas seems like the better route to my mind.
Totally. So Mark, you're like a free speech absolutist.
Almost.
No, I mean, I think if we had to rank ourselves in terms of where we protect speech, there's the true absolutist who says, even when you're paying for the assassin and calling him to do stuff, it's just words, man. I don't fall in that category. And I think Mork does either.
No.
I do want pretty strong protections for speech. Maybe I'd admit of more limitations than Mork. I think maybe we'll debate a little bit about, like, I think the Constitution kind of gets it right, for example. So I think when you're advocating hatred against one of those groups and you're inciting harm against them, that's a good reason to hold you liable. And that harm is different to violence. But I'm not going to say, in other words, on the stuff that's merely offensive, I'm going to say it's protected.
Okay. So
Respect.
I guess hate speech does exist then. But yeah, no, it's been a very fascinating and interesting conversation, Mark. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time to chat with us. I think, I'm comfortable with my view on this topic. I think we all are. I think we're all, but it was very interesting. And thank you for also giving us a lot of insight into how the law works, how the hate speech, all that stuff works. I think the viewers also enjoyed it.
I had one last question for Mark. It's super short. You probably can't answer it because of on a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 being the cutest little kitten in the world, and 10 being like either Hitler or Stalin, how authoritarian do you think Julius is? You can blink as an answer if you can't answer it. No, just kidding. Sorry.
I'll tell you guys off the record.
But do you think you're going to win the case?
Yes.
Justice.
Look at that. He's strong. He won't answer. He's very strong. No, it's good.
No, because I was telling Joe this. I'm going like, I'm against the sort of like the whole, your entire case had me sort of as a libertarian believing that. At the same time, I was going like, the only reason I want it to happen is I want that equality before the law. I want there to be, because it feels like it's unequal. Like I want them, if everybody else is going to get charged, then you being a person and a person in specific power, I want them to go like, okay, cool. This is, unfortunately, you can't then.
Well, that's why Mark Oppenheimer was there when it went to the Supreme High Court of Appeal, and he was acting as the friend of the court, I think is the term, Mark. Yeah. Where he argued, that we need to keep things equal and blah, blah, blah. Just because Julius is a politician doesn't mean he gets favor, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing heavily what he said. It was a very powerful, what's the term I'm looking for?
Argument.
It was not argument, yes, that Mark gave, which you can go see, by the way, I think on the FMF channel. I think they put his section of the argument on there. Please, maybe I'll link it in the description below, and you guys can have a listen to it. Is there, just for shits and giggles, man, is there anything you can say about, Juju?
Yeah, so basically the bar rule is that I can give you an idea of what the cases I'm involved in are about, what the legal principles are. I'm not allowed to prognosticate about what the outcomes will be. So that's why my restricted answers.
Okay,
and the matter is currently on appeal. So
Yeah.
once the finality, I could go into some more detail about it.
And I'm going to ask you questions, and you can just stay silent if you can't answer. Do you think it's a situation right now where if EFF lose the appeal, then they're going to appeal it to the Constitutional Court, and vice versa with AfriForum? Do you think that's going to happen?
I think we have to wait and see. In other words, both parties would have appeal rights. Whether they exercise them is a separate question.
That's a very good lawyer answer. I like it. Yeah, you kept yourself in the clear there. All right, Mark, I have kept you long enough, my friend. Thank you once again so much for coming onto the show, being willing to chat to us about this stuff. I think, once again, the audience probably learned a bit about how the law works, which is exactly what we wanted. And now we know a little bit more about how the hate speech situation works. Maybe we'll have you back on in a few weeks, in a month's time. We can talk about defamation. I think defamation will also be a very interesting topic to get into, because there's also a lot of confusion with that specifically. But if there's anything else, Mark, you want to say, remind people again where they can catch you, your YouTube channel, all that stuff.
Yeah, so if you're interested in the philosophy work, check out Brain Navat. If you're interested in litigation, my personal channel, which is just Mark Oppenheimer on YouTube, has a playlist of most of the cases I've been involved in that were televised and other public appearances. So you can watch the whole Kill the Boer case, you can watch the appeal, you can watch the flag case. There's other matters in the Constitutional Court that are all there.
Excellent. Mork, sign us off.
Thanks so much, Mark. And thanks so much for all the viewers watching. Remember to hit the like, hit the subscribe, and we'll see you guys soon. Joe, as they always say,
stay based.